So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second of the 2014 Darwin College Lectures, which, as you know, is on this broad theme of plagues. And I'd like to welcome not just everybody here in this hall, but people in the other halls on the video link, and also to the many thousands of people who watch later on all around the world, because the lectures are freely available on the web. And while I mention that, I'll just say that last week's lecture, given by the Vice-Chancellor, is now up and live on the through the Darwin College website. So you can watch that again or watch it for the first time. As I've said before, this is a very important year for Darwin College because we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of our founding as the first college in the University of Cambridge that's exclusively for graduate students, and also the first mixed college. We had a very small beginning, but now we're amongst the largest colleges with an alumni body that encompasses every subject and are spread right around the world. And so I'm really pleased to welcome tonight's lecturers from St John's College, because St John's was one of our founding colleges. And so we have Mary and Christopher Dobson with us today. Mary is a medical historian and formerly director of Oxford's Wellcome Institute for the History of Medicine. She's an academic and popular author. Her latest book, The Story of Medicine, From Bloodletting to Biotechnology, is just out. I have managed to buy a copy from Heifers. And her next book, I gather, Murderous Contagion, is due in the autumn. Chris Dobson is Professor of Chemical and Structural Biology in the Department of Chemistry. He's also the Master of St John's College. In recognition of his work on protein misfolding and disorders like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and type 2 diabetes, he's a Fellow of the Royal Society, of the Academy of Medical Sciences, and a Foreign Associate of the US National Academy. Now, this evening, Mary and Chris are going to take us on a medical journey from antiquity through the Middle Ages to the Spanish flu and to modern times, and through the silent plagues that go hand in hand with poverty or affect aging populations. So I warmly welcome Mary and Chris Dobson to speak on plagues in history.
So first of all, let me express my great gratitude to the Master of Darwin, Professor Mary Fowler, to all the fellows, students and staff of Darwin for inviting us to give this talk in this really wonderful series, and for making us already feel so incredibly welcome. It's in fact the first time in 36 years of marriage that Mary and I have ever given a talk together. But when our children were small, their favourite game they'd invented was called Experts and Helpers. Needless to say, I was always the helper, and they were always the experts. And so I feel very well prepared for this double act, as I'm again very firmly the helper, because Mary is the expert. I've learned a huge amount from her, and not only has it been enormously interesting, but also it's been of huge benefit in my scientific research, as I hope you'll see during the talk, which, as Mary said, will take us through, I think, 3,000 years of disease in less than 60 minutes. So I suspect that for many people in this audience, like me, their first encounter with the topic of this lecture was from stories of the biblical plagues of Egypt. And one of the themes that Mary and I want to draw out is that although many of the diseases at the time, whether they were mythical or real events, were not understood, but modern scholars are looking for natural causes for various afflictions. And one example of this in Egypt is, for example, the Plague of Blood, which some people think is because in times of very unusual weather conditions, there was a huge algal bloom, and freshwater algae, when they die, can turn red, and so the water could have turned red for natural causes. So The term plague itself, I took this from my schoolboy dictionary, means a blow, a stroke, or wound from the Latin. It's used to mean affliction, calamity, evil, visitation of divine anger. We'll see all of these things. But it's also a general name for any malignant disease which men or beasts are stricken. And again, we'll see examples of this, and we'll also use it in the more classic sense for the bubonic plague. Now, to illustrate the sort of nature of the plague, I thought I'd just show these data from the United States from 1900 up to the 1960s, where one can see the deaths per 1,000 of the population. And against a background of general falling mortality from infectious diseases, you can see this tremendous spike of a very rapid development of disease. This influenza, the Spanish flu that was mentioned, goes up here and then takes its toll of the population, falls again, and comes back to these sorts of levels. So this is a classic plague, a burst of an infectious disease that then dies away again. And Mary will say a good bit more about the flu, both Spanish flu and other flus, later in the talk. But one of the central things that we wanted to do was actually to ask the questions that I think we all ask in times of calamity, which is why now, why here, and particularly why me? And one of the things that we're going to do, and this came from a lot of discussion with Mary, was to touch on contemporary explanations, such things as divine intervention, miasmas, supernatural phenomena, but also particularly to look at the modern explanations, which I think are really all connected in some way with the enormous progress in human society over the last few thousand years. And such factors as population, settlement size and density, proximity to animals and also to insects, the existence of war and the mass movement of populations because of war or because of other forms of travel, the opening up of new worlds and new environments, the increasing speed of travel over the ages, and the rapidly changing lifestyles. And I think the next slide shows this really very dramatically, because it shows, as an example, the world population growth and the speed of global travel from 1850 up to 2000. And so you can see that the population of the world in 1850 was less than 500 million. It's now, by 2000, it was 6 billion, and is now higher. By contrast, the length of time it takes you to get around the world in 1850 was, if you're lucky, about a year, and by 2000, a couple of days, unless you're an astronaut. So there's this huge change in population and this huge decrease in the time that it takes to get from one place to another. And I think one can see the examples of this in changes in the global dynamics of major infections. So, for example, the Black Death, again, that Mary is going to say more about, in the 14th century, took, I think, 7 years to travel with the populations from Central Asia to Europe. SARS, in the early part of this century, I think 2003, I think took about 7 days to go from a lift shaft in Hong Kong to Chinatown in Toronto. So there's enormous changes in the dynamics of disease. Now, one thing that hasn't changed very much over the years is the fear of plagues. We're not only frightened of them, we seem to have this almost infectious sort of wish to know more about them in a sort of really, I think, slightly uncomfortable way. And of course, the media, newspapers, the movie industry, and so on, play on these fears and this fascination in a big way. And this is a film some of you might have experienced called Contagion, and I just wanted to show you a very brief clip from it.
Get back in your car! We're not sick!
It's figuring us out faster than we're figuring it out.
It's mutated.
well, pretty scary stuff. And so I'm going to hand over to Mary in a moment, but I'm then going to come back because I'm going to take us on another little journey as we contain infections, improve hygiene, we get other things happening. And one of the, sometimes called the plague of the 21st century, which I'll talk about. And I think this is a marvellous cartoon, retirement age protest, which says, what do we want? Why did we come here? And what were we saying? And when Mary's given her talk, if I can remember why we came here and what we were saying, I'll be back to say more about this. So I hope that's an introduction to Mary's part, who's going to now start off with something a few thousand years before this one. So, Mary, over to you.
Thank you. Well, let me first echo Chris's gratitude to the Master and Fellows of Darwin for inviting us here, and my own thanks to Chris, the mastermind, who has done so much to help with this presentation, as well as to our sons, Richard and William, who are still certainly technologically experts in our family. And I know Richard has particularly helped us with this presentation. Before doing so, I thought I should just share a comment with you. If you ever thought that it would be good to live in a bygone age, think again. But as Chris and I have discovered through our mutual interests, this topic of plagues and history is not just all grim and gory, it's also gripping. And we'll try and show how history has undoubtedly generated plagues, as plagues have undoubtedly shaped history. One of the first well-recorded historic plagues is the so-called Plague of the Philistines, which took place more than 3,000 years ago in the Middle East. Historical accounts suggest that the Ark of the Covenant was stolen by the Philistines from the Israelites, but it's reported that they soon gave it back because of the outbreak of a series of plagues. Like most plagues of the past, its origin is hotly disputed. But if you see this quotation from the Bible, as it indicates, it is no surprise that they rushed to give it back. The Lord smote the men, and they had hemorrhoids in their secret parts. Hemorrhoids might have been hemorrhoids. It sounds very unpleasant. About 800 years later was the Plague of Athens, where it is thought that about a third of the population died, including the great statesman Pericles, shown here on the right. And again, picking up on one of our themes that Chris mentioned, the city became extremely crowded as the enemy advanced and people rushed in from the countryside. Along with poor sanitation, the crowding soon led to an outbreak of a highly contagious disease. Again, it's fascinating to speculate what this could have been, as historians do. Suggestions are anything from typhoid fever, even to measles, including Ebola virus, which some of you might link up to films like Contagion and Outbreak. And as this famous quotation indicates, people had no idea why this was happening, but simply saw that perfectly healthy people suddenly became sick and died in huge numbers. It's really quite sad when we look back at all these plagues and the devastation and the puzzlement and the bewilderment. Although, as I say, as Chris has said, with modern retrospective analysis, we can try and make connecting themes. Moving on then, 600 odd years later, another famous plague took place known as the Antonine Plague, after the emperor, and spread throughout the Roman Empire, again reflecting the effects of the transmission of disease through mass movements of large numbers of troops. It's also known as the Plague of Galen, and I'm sure everyone here is familiar with Galen. He described it, and obviously his influence on medicine was profound for the next 1,000 years. And we begin to get clues. From his descriptions, scholars have speculated it might be smallpox, a disease I'll come back to later. And as with so many contemporary reports, the words of Marcus Aurelius, now well known to many through the epic and gory film Gladiator, Glory and Gory, are extraordinarily poignant, reflecting the horror of those who found themselves in the midst of the plague. Weep not for me, think rather of the pestilence and the deaths of so many. Moving on nearly 400 years, we come to another famous plague, the Plague of Justinian, that spread through the Byzantine Empire, again associated with mass migration of armies and their followers, and possibly triggered also by unusual climatic change. This plague is of tremendous importance because evidence from the descriptions of the time and from DNA analysis indicate that it was likely to have been the first recorded outbreak of a strain of Yersinia pestis, or bubonic plague, about which more later. But again, puzzlement and bewilderment. As we can see from this quotation, people at the time still had little idea what was happening and were completely perplexed by the apparent randomness of its victims. In the case of this disease, alone the difference availed naught. The topic of bubonic plagues brings us to the medieval world, a time of the most famous plague in all human history. In the mid-14th century, the Black Death, known at the time as the Great Mortality or the Big Sickness, not known as the Black Death until much later, afflicted much of the known world. The image on the left shows the appearance of buboes on the bodies of both a woman and a man. It was during this plague that Boccaccio, on the right, wrote the Decameron, one of the great works of medical literature, of medieval literature, medieval literature, but also medical literature. Not surprisingly, his comments on the plague are particularly emotive. How many valiant men, how many fair ladies, breakfasted with their kinsfolk, and that same night supped with their ancestors. It is likely that the disease spread from Central Asia via the Silk Road, again reflecting the significance of trade and travel across the world. It is thought that as many as 50 million people could have died from the Black Death. Possibly 1/3 of the population of Europe. That's huge. This was the single most disastrous epidemic or epidemiological event in history and resulted in huge social and economic changes. On the top are skeletons from Venice under a burial plague pit, and below an abandoned village in Cambridgeshire. It's such a vast topic, the impact, and I'm relieved that Professor Ian Morris, in a forthcoming lecture in this series on plagues and economic collapse, will tell us much more about the impact of the Black Death in different parts of the world. Again, just go back to the individual reaction. The Italian poet Petrarch, whose beloved Laura died in 1348 from the Black Death in Avignon, highlights again words of great poignancy and also the lack of understanding what was happening. What abyss swallowed them? There was a crowd of us. Now we are almost alone. It's almost unimaginable to think back to the devastation caused by the Black Death. The obvious explanation for many was the wrath of God, punishing sinful humans, and prayer and penitence were the order of the day for many. Here we see on the left, San Roque, one of the patron saints of plague, pointing to a bubo. And on the right, an image of the flagellants, who whipped themselves in acts of penitence. But people were now beginning to think harder about the reasons for these catastrophes. In Cambridge, for example, when the Black Death arrived, it seems that almost the whole population of some of the poorest parts of the city, for example around the castle, perished. And it's thought that maybe half of the population of Cambridge died in the Black Death. Again, unimaginable. A few years later, members of the university were begging the townspeople to clean the streets because they suspected that noxious vapours, or miasmas, from the Greek word to pollute, were perhaps the cause or part of the cause of the disease. We can only imagine the stench of Cambridge at the time. Well, doom and gloom, and I suppose one should look on the survival, the adaptation, and regeneration. And after the Black Death, there was need of regeneration. And indeed, several Cambridge colleges, such as Corpus Christi, seen on the left in a login print of 1688, and in a modern photograph of the oldest, I think, court in Cambridge, were founded in particular to train priests for the ministry, to replace the vast number of clerics who had died during the Black Death. Plague was, or bubonic plague was, however, far from over, and we move on to the early modern world. It struck again and again with vengeance, though not on quite the same scale as the Black Death. At the time of the Great Plague in London in 1665 to 1666, people who could manage to do so fled to escape the infection, though, as the Vice-Chancellor said last week when he showed a similar image, death went with them in the form of an incipient infection. The attempts in many of the major cities of Europe to cope with the disaster were manifold. I'll leave you time to read this rather grim description, which makes the NHS sound not too bad. So, pest houses were established, but yes, they were certainly places of horror. It was also a time when, are we going to get a light up there? We have one? When the famous plague doctors appeared with their protective clothing and masks full of herbs, often carrying fumigating torches. Sorry, I could not find a fumigating torch, but we've done our best, and here is a wonderful other mask from Venice, and any of you who, like us, are fans of going to Venice will be very familiar with the Venetians using these masks in all sorts of carnivals and settings. I think I'm going to hand that to Chris. It's not going to stay. But their appearance, as you can see, could hardly have done much to cheer up the general population. There were other practical measures to deal with the infection. Bonfires were ordered to be set up in the streets, and like the plague doctors, people carried sweet-smelling herbs to try to ward off the evil miasmas. And in London, the authorities ordered the killing of cats, dogs, and hogs. Actually, not rats, which is interesting. Well, I'll come back to that. Again, the religious element comes in, as you can see in this slide, or just about see. Red crosses and "Lord, have mercy on this house" were put on the door of affected houses, reflecting the interplay of many divine and natural causes then thought to be behind the plague. Indeed, more organised public health measures were beginning to be introduced, such as quarantine, from the Italian word for 40 days, which was first set up shortly after the arrival of the Black Death in the Venetian Republic. And it reflected the fact that ships that were possibly carrying infection were forced for 40 days, initially 30, then 40, to stay in the harbour or unload and disinfect their cargoes and passengers by wonderfully bizarre methods at lazarettos, such as, in this old map on the left, Lazaretto Nuovo, which is near the Venetian island of Burano. And the buildings at the Lazaretto Nuovo can still be visited today. It's a fascinating place to go. Chris and I recently spent a couple of hours in this atmospheric place, but by then were extremely pleased when the Vaporetto stopped to take us to Burano to return to modernity in our favourite restaurant. Building on the public health theme, there were orders given, such as this royal proclamation of particular interest in this city. Don't worry about trying to read all the script, but basically what it is saying is that the King's Majesty, foreseeing the danger, especially to his University of Cambridge, during this epidemic of plague, commands all his loving subjects whatsoever to forbear to repair this year to the Stourbridge Fair. This was one of the biggest fairs in Europe. So the idea was stop people coming together in this great fair. And of course, there were many other remedies that were tried, tested, and who knows whether they worked, including, rather grimly at the top there, a medieval woodcut piercing the buboes, bloodletting on the left, which is an ancient and popular practice for any ailments, but tried out with many plagues in the past, as well as taking all sorts of concoctions from viper fat, crab's eyes, as well as exotic remedies such as theriac or Venetian treacle, which contained serpent's flesh. Fortunately, for the so-called quack doctors who preyed on people's fears, a few of their customers were in a position to complain about the lack of efficacy of their remedies. Samuel Pepys wrote that he was put into an ill conception of myself and my smell during the Great Plague of London, and was forced to buy some rolled tobacco to smell and chaw, which took away the apprehension. Tobacco, like alcohol, was thought to be one of the great antidotes. The tolls of mortality was huge, as this one list from a London Bill of Mortality shows. Out of over 8,000 burials in just 1 week, more than 7,000 had died of the plague. I'd love to pause so you can see all the other descriptions, but there are a few other intriguing causes of death here. 3 died frighted, 51 from griping of the guts, and even 1 from lethargy. But we're talking about plagues in this lecture, so I should move on. And equally grim is the description on the left. Bodies had to be stacked up in mass graves, as this emotive Italian description reminds us. I did have to check whether lasagna was introduced at that time, but it seems it was. There was a continued search to find the cause of plagues, or bubonic plague, but it was not until the late 19th century, in fact nearly 2 centuries after the plague had ceased to be a problem in Western Europe, for reasons which are both mysterious and intriguing, before the bacterium causing plague was discovered by Alexandra Yersin during a plague epidemic in Hong Kong. And although there is still argument about the role of rats, the much maligned black rat, and other rodents, the general view of bubonic plague is that the bacterium, now known as Yersinia pestis, was passed by infected fleas as they abandoned dying rats to feed off nearby humans, thus transmitting the disease. This is a classic example of a zoonosis, when diseases jump the species barrier. And although historians have long argued about whether the Black Death, the Justinian plague, were the same as the Oriental plague discovered when Yersin made his discoveries, recent DNA analysis of skeletal remains from Black Death burial pits, as well as those dating back to the Justinian period, suggest that Yersinia pestis may well have been the cause of the historic plagues. But it's a long and complicated story. So we then quickly move on to the discovery of rats and their fleas and the means of prevention and treatment. And this led to much more effective means, as we can see with these rat catchers in Liverpool, who are dipping the bodies of rats into petrol to kill the fleas. And again, the picture illustrates the key role in plague of trade and travel into and out of ports, such as Liverpool, where the danger of transmission was perceived to be greatest. Although it was still several decades before effective antibiotics were developed to treat people who contracted plague. Bubonic, as well as its other deadly forms, and I haven't had time to talk about pneumonic, septicemic, you probably don't want to know, continues to emerge occasionally around the globe, but it is no longer, fortunately, a mass killer as it had been for dating back to at least 1,500 years. Bubonic plague is the classic plague, as we have seen, but there have been many other diseases that have continued to plague humanity. As Sidney Smith wrote to Lady Grey in 1836, "I hope that Lord Grey and you are well. No easy thing, seeing as there are about 1,500 diseases to which man is subject." And of course, I couldn't resist adding a special one for the college, recalling Charles Darwin's frequent bouts of perplexing ill health when he wrote at the age of, I think, around 36, "Many of my friends, I believe, think me a hypochondriac." I'm sure he wasn't, but I haven't got time to go into 1,500 diseases, Charles Darwin's medical history. I'm going to skip to just a few of the other major pandemics. Starting and keeping to the early modern world, one of these is smallpox, which in two senses of the meaning is a disease of the past. Descriptions of this really dreadful disease appear throughout recorded history, and it has claimed famous victims, including, we believe, the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses V and Queen Mary II of England, and many others, from paupers to princes alike. Don't worry about the map, you probably can't see very well, but the aim of putting this up is to say that smallpox is also an infamous disease because it's one that illustrates dramatically one of our themes, the rate of human travel. So once Europeans started travelling to the Americas, opening up the New World, they found a population with no immunity to many infectious diseases, particularly smallpox, which it seems was a major contributor. There are other factors, but smallpox is really quite important to the collapse of civilizations in the New World. In return, again, don't worry about the diseases flowing. I think the main point is to say that diseases flowed in different directions as new worlds were opened up. And in return, during this so-called Columbian disease exchange, the Americas probably gave Europe other diseases, the most contested of which is syphilis or as it was known, the Great Pox. But smallpox is a disease with a happy ending, because Jenner's introduction of a vaccine in the late 18th century spread rapidly around the world. And I think this is also a good reminder that medical technologies, as well as pathogens, rely on speed of transport. And while there were still about 2 million deaths every year in the mid-20th century, there was increasing optimism in the 1960s that it could be eradicated. So although there was never a cure for smallpox, and I always think that's a very interesting aspect of this disease, there was never a cure, just the vaccine as a prevention. Following the decision of the World Health Organization in 1966, albeit by 2 votes, to embark on an intensified global eradication program, the world was declared free from smallpox, save from now the virus still being stored in 2 high-security labs. But sadly, smallpox is a unique case, although there are hopes that diseases such as polio, again, also without a cure, will eventually be eradicated by vaccination campaigns. At the same time that smallpox was being addressed by vaccination, not always a straightforward process, as the Vice-Chancellor talked last week about the anti-vaccination campaigns that took place in the 19th century, other changes in society and globalization were bringing with them new plagues in the Victorian world. This time associated not just with increased speed of travel, but also with the rapid onset of industrialization, the flood of people to cities, and the unsanitary conditions and poverty of people living in slums. Cholera pandemics from Asia spread across the globe. And this is one of my favorite quotes. People realized that the appalling conditions and lack of sanitation was a serious problem. Sir, we ain't got no privies. The sewer company take no notice whatsoever of our complaints. The stench of a gully hole is disgusting. If the cholera comes, Lord help us. Well, smell was seen as one factor, but we are reminded that in the early 1850s, in the early 1850s, there was still no clue as to the real cause of cholera, and all sorts of possible explanations were being aired. I'm sure many of you know the story of John Snow, another tantalizing discovery in the history of medicine, who realized that a cholera epidemic in the 1850s in London was dependent on the nature of water supplies, and with brilliant mapping and statistical analysis, he concluded that the disease was not airborne, i.e. transmitted by miasmas or bad airs, bad smells, but was transmitted through contaminated water. This and the so-called Great Stink of London in 1858 prompted the building of new underground sewer systems that improved public health dramatically. Think about what's below you as you walk through the streets of London and what might have been above you at this period. But like Jenner with his smallpox vaccination, such extraordinary feats showed what could be done to prevent disease even before scientists had unraveled their mysterious causes. Well, just going quickly, the plague bacteria we have talked about, cholera was also identified, this time by Robert Koch. And he as well identified the bacterium that caused TB. I should say, tragically, lack of sanitation is still a problem for many of the poorer parts of the world today, with an estimated 1.5 billion people having no access to improved sanitation or simple necessities like indoor toilets and water supplies, and many are dying of diseases that could be easily prevented. Well, finally, for me, let me touch on some of the plagues of the 20th century, of which the most dramatic example is influenza, so-called Spanish flu, initially gaining its name from wartime censorship rules that allowed for reporting on the disease ravages in neutral Spain, so not necessarily originating in Spain. 1918 to 1919 killed more than the First World War in an astonishingly short time, taking with it primarily young adults, for reasons yet not fully understood. In fact, the word influenza originates from the meaning of the Latin heavenly influence, and we look back and I think there are still very many puzzles as to why this Spanish flu spread so dramatically and sadly across the world. But at the time, as the Times itself of 1918 pointed out, there was a stoical acceptance along and after the horrors of the war that led to the pandemic being almost forgotten by historians till recent times. Never since the Black Death has such a plague swept over the face of the world. Never, perhaps, has a plague been so stoically accepted. But as we're all too familiar with today, the reasons of resurgence of interest in the Spanish flu has come primarily from the emergence of recent forms of influenza, largely through the reassortment of human, swine, and bird flu viruses in animal hosts. And some of the recent investigations are also throwing light on the ancestral strains that might have well caused the Spanish flu. Asking those sort of questions that Chris raised at the beginning. Why now? Why here? Why me? I could say that about me being here today, but these are important for scientists today. So research into the origins of the 1918-19 flu could prevent another pandemic from happening again. Although some say a future pandemic of influenza is overdue, the clock is still ticking. We just don't know what time it is. Let's hope. And that, of course, takes us back to the theme of the Contagion movie, which Chris showed earlier. And finally, for me, on the history of infectious diseases is a very modern plague, another viral disease that's estimated to have killed over 25 million people around the world since its supposedly sudden appearance in the early 1980s. Sub-Saharan Africa has been especially badly hit by this new pandemic, now described as a disease of poverty, as well as a resurgence and comorbidity with an ancient disease, tuberculosis, which was formerly known as the White Plague, for which antibiotic resistance is currently a major problem. While the onset of HIV/AIDS epidemic shocked the world in the early 1980s, like plague and flu, and indeed possibly around 3/4 of all human infections, its early origin has now been linked to a cross-species transfer from animal host to humans, a concept often known as spillover. And this may well have happened perhaps 100 years or so before it spread rapidly around the globe through human transmission. Again, another fascinating story of historians, scientists getting together to understand not just the dynamics and the history, but also the origins of some of these major plagues. Drugs have and are being developed. AIDS is an example of a disease where effective drugs have been designed by rational means, based on the knowledge that has emerged from the dramatic advances in science and medicine. Although so far, sadly, the development of an effective vaccine has proved to be beyond our capabilities. Nevertheless, a trip through 3,000 years of plagues illustrates the enormous triumphs of modern medicine. With antibiotics, vaccines, and public health measures, as well as many social and economic changes contributing to improvements in standards of living, these have all led to dramatic reductions in the cases and spread of infectious diseases. And the results of such efforts is a massive increase in life expectancy in many parts of the world, not all, but in many, in the past 150 or so years. And I think Chris, who is looking like the plague doctor in the background there, he will now take over to give you a brief summary of how this change in the human condition, this extension of our lifespan, which has brought so many huge benefits, but also leading to new plagues of affluence and aging. Chris, I will leave it to you.
Thank you for that really wonderful trip through history. And I'm taking over now for the last part of the talk. And again, as Mary said, there has been this enormous increase in life expectancy in many countries of the world. And if we look at recently in Cambridge, for example, the average life expectancy, astonishingly, in the 1860s was about 35 years. It's now 80 years or more. So this tremendous increase in the lifespans of large numbers of people through the abolition largely of infectious diseases has resulted in unexpected increases in a range of non-infectious forms of disease that were almost unknown even in the quite recent past. And I'm going to talk about these for the last few minutes. The most famous, most dramatic example of this is Alzheimer's disease. And again, I think sort of astonishingly, it's only 100 years or so ago that this disease was first described. And then Alzheimer himself was studying a case of somebody who was only 51 and therefore undoubtedly had a very early onset form of the disease. This rise of dementias, particularly Alzheimer's, comes very clearly from, I think, these data from the US. This is plotting the rate of disease per over a period of time from 1960s on to about 2000s. Again, it's the USA, as I say. And this is a logarithmic scale. And if you look at the top, for example, at heart disease, over that period of time, the incidence has come down through modern medicine by something like a factor of 5. If you look down here at Alzheimer's disease, the number of cases reported, at least, over the last 30 to 40 years has increased by a factor of 100. Another aspect of the Alzheimer's disease, which one can very easily describe, is the financial impact of its incidence. Again, these are data from the US. In 2010, it was estimated that the cost to the US economy of Alzheimer's disease was nearly $200 billion in that 1 year. As time goes on, over the next 40 years, the cost is predicted to go to over $1 trillion per year in 2050. And this is largely because one needs to take care of large numbers of people, often for many years, taking a lot of time and effort from large numbers of people. This increase is almost completely attributable to the increasing life expectancy of the world. The chance of getting Alzheimer's disease at the age of 65 is about 1 in 1,000. When you reach the age of 85, the chance is 1 in 3 or even higher. A dramatic statistic, I think, about our aging population is that of all the members of the human race in history who've reached the age of 65, more than half are people alive today. Really a dramatic, huge change in life expectancy. Well, finance is one thing, but even more dramatic than the financial cost of Alzheimer's disease is, of course, its human cost. I think that this is a disease that's extraordinarily distressing, not just for the patients, but for relatives and friends. And I doubt if there's anybody in this room who hasn't had their lives touched in some way, either as a family or friend of a victim of this dreaded disease. Again, it's a situation that is very much taken up by newspapers and television and films and so forth. Hardly a day goes past when you don't read about the impact of Alzheimer's disease on the NHS and healthcare in this country. And there are endless stories of hopes for future treatments. Many of you might have seen this particular film. I'm going to show again a very short clip. It's a film of Iris, a really emotional film about the writer Iris Murdoch, who suffered from this disease.
Judi Dench.
I wrote. Such things you wrote. Special things. Secret things.
Academy Award winner Jim Broadbent.
You see, words have meant everything to her.
I think we can hardly watch that without thinking of people we know. At last, at very long last, one might say, the threat of this type of disease has made its way into the political arena. And this is just one quote. This is from the Prime Minister at the G8 summit late in 2013. It sums it up rather well. It doesn't matter whether you're in London or Los Angeles, in rural India or urban Japan. This disease steals lives. It wrecks families. It breaks hearts. And that is why all of us here are so utterly determined to beat it. So what I thought I would do in the last few moments is try to give you at least a little flavour of some of the science that's going on to try and address the origins of diseases such as Alzheimer's and perhaps to work towards potential therapies. And one of the reasons for doing this is that I think it has remarkable links to the historical themes of infectious plagues that we've heard about before. And this picture just gives you a schematic image of a cell. It happens to be a bacterial cell. It's very similar other types of cells within us. And if you look at this image, you can see that the essential molecules of life, particularly proteins that carry out or control everything that we do, from breathing to eating to moving our muscles to thinking and so forth, they, with other molecules, have evolved to pack together, to carry out effectively a huge number of very highly regulated functions in this complex environment. And it's an environment where any type of perturbation can generate instability. Like our planet, if you like, our cells are highly crowded, and in a similar manner, they're vulnerable to rapid changes in lifestyle. And indeed, the changes that tend to happen in these diseases are these proteins which are essentially soluble and independent in the solutions within cells, start to clump together and become deposited. And these are images from Alzheimer's disease. These are pictures of deposits within the brain tissue. This is plaques, the famous Alzheimer plaques, which are found in the brain. Also tangles of another protein which are found within cells. And one of the features of this clumping together and aggregation of proteins is the proteins don't just lose function, but they're misfolded, which means that they interact inappropriately with all the other components in the cell. And so they're actually toxic. And so when this clumping together, this aggregation occurs, it leads to toxicity and subsequent neuronal death, which you can see in this image, due to the shrinkage of the brain. And, of course, in people with the disease, all the well-known symptoms of loss of memory and brain function that go with it. I mean, again, just perhaps to give you a sort of flavor of some of this, one of the ways we've been thinking about this recently is that life really is on the molecular edge, just as it is, if you like, on the human edge. Our proteins are very delicately poised together. They're interacting with each other properly under most conditions. When they're soluble, you have health, but they can very easily be tipped over into clumping together and aggregating where you get disease. So our proteins are poised very closely at this narrow boundary between solubility, which gives function and health, and aggregation, which gives deposition and toxicity and disease. And again, in the course of thinking about this lecture, you can rationalize this on the basis of evolutionary factors, Darwinian factors, because proteins have been packed together as effectively as possible in cells so they can work more efficiently, and so organisms can compete in the evolutionary survival of the fittest. But in fact, Alzheimer's is just one of a family of diseases that I call post-evolutionary diseases. You can see that Darwin doesn't approve of this at all. He's trying to shut me up about it. But it's because, again, things have changed so fast in human history. And there are about 50 other disorders which are, again, associated with proteins that aggregate and clump together. I've mentioned Alzheimer's disease, also Parkinson's disease, motor neuron disease, where the deposits occur in the brains and give rise to neuronal death. In type 2 diabetes, the same type of process occurs, but there it occurs in the pancreas and gives rise to deaths of islet cells, which affects the production of insulin. And there are even diseases which result, or disorders that result from putting people on medical treatment, people on dialysis for long periods of time. Protein concentrations change, and when protein concentrations change, then they tip over the edge and start to aggregate. And so you can see these modern diseases, we think, are linked to changes in the concentrations. The human analog is population, trafficking of proteins around the cell and the body, the analog of travel, and the lifespans of proteins. Proteins have a lifespan within us, just as we have lifespans. And changes in these can result in pathogenic aggregation, but these changes are themselves a consequence of our changes, rapid changes in diet, in diabetes, medical practices, and particularly this increasing longevity. But having said that, I want to end on a somewhat more optimistic note, although you can do quite a lot about diabetes by eating in some establishments rather than others. But I think there is real hope for the future. This is what we have at our present retirement age protests, but there are intensive efforts being made in Cambridge and many other places to understand the basic physicochemical principles that do underlie these ways these proteins interact. And the hope is that by understanding these principles, we can use rational means that Mary talked about, for example, that have been so successful in treating aids by using the methods of modern science to understand the processes which are occurring. And developments in science and the history of humankind's response to challenges gives us huge grounds for optimism. So I'm an optimist. I think this is where we are at the moment. I think we want to get to this point where we know what we want, we know why we came here, and we know what we're saying. And I'm just going to give you one example of the type of experiment that one can do to sort of test some of these principles. And this is some work that's been going on in our lab in collaboration with genetics and clinical school. It involves the use of a model system, fruit flies, and by making transgenic fruit flies, you can induce a form of Alzheimer's disease in these flies. And what you see in this little film is some flies. These are flies which have got a nasty form of dementia from the actually being transgenic in a protein which is associated with a familial human disease. And what we've done here is to find ways, in this case mutation, but there are many other ways, of reducing the aggregation propensity, reducing the probability of clumping together. And you can see that these are very happy flies. They're climbing up and down, and they're effectively have avoided the neuronal damage that comes from this clumping together. So fantastic news for demented fruit flies at the moment. With hope, we can translate, or others can translate, some of these ideas into human treatments. So that's really what I want to end, except just to bring together these themes that Mary and I have talked about. And I can't stress how much ideas that we've had have come from talking to Mary. I think the lessons from 3 millennia of human experience, these are very simple points, but I think important. Plagues, whether infectious diseases or modern Alzheimer plague, if you like, result from rapid changes in human lifestyle, behavior, and so forth. The result is that humanity responds by trying to understand the underlying cause of disease by whatever means it has going for it at the time. And the history is that such understanding leads to means of prevention and treatment. And I'm personally extremely optimistic that we'll be able to at least ameliorate the symptoms and perhaps reduce the probability of Alzheimer's disease and other related diseases in the years ahead. I wanted just to put up a couple of images of great Cambridge heroes of science, as Charles Darwin, again great for this lecture series, and it's his work on evolution that has taught us so much about the plagues of the past and is teaching us, I think, about these plagues of the 21st century. And I also want to put up a picture of Fred Sanger, another one of the greatest scientists ever, whose work in enabling us to sequence proteins, sequence genomes, has ushered in the era of modern medicine. And he was appropriately awarded by a unique honor of having 2 Nobel Prizes in chemistry for his work. I think he deserved even more. So let me literally finish now by some thanks. I want to thank again the Master of Darwin for inviting the 2 of us here. I want to thank you for being a lovely audience and not disappearing when the lights go down. And I want particularly to thank this person who is really the expert in this area. It's been fantastic. Over 40 years or so that I've known her, I've learnt a huge amount. And it's been a great privilege to speak with her today. So thank you very much. Right on time.
So thank you both very much indeed for transporting us across the history of plagues, through the horrors and the tragedies and some of the triumphs of the past, as well as our current and future threats, but the opportunities that are there. Now, you mentioned the SARS outbreak in 2003 that spread so rapidly from China, yet was stopped. And I'm just reminded of a lovely memorial in a Hong Kong park. It's a memorial to the selfless actions of some immensely brave medical staff who isolated themselves in the hospital. They were prepared to sacrifice themselves, so they isolated themselves with their patients in order that the disease would not spread. The numbers involved in plagues are huge, and yet individuals can make a difference. I'm just glad, though, that my doctor doesn't look like this gentleman up here. Now, we set a record tonight. This is the first double act ever in the 29 years that the Darwin College lecture series has been running. Next week, we leave medicine, and we continue with a lecture by Mikko Hyppönen, who's going to speak on silicon plagues. So he's going to take us to the world of cybersecurity, which obviously also affects all of us. So now, once again, Chris and Mary, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.